In this session, I feel I need to speak about forgiveness and repentance, humility. That is so important to see revival. And God taught me a lot of lessons in the refugee camps, because it's so easy to think that somehow you are important when you're leading and discipling pastors, and that you're in a position where people are coming to you and asking you for favors and to do things because they think that somehow you're important. So it's so important to do what Jesus said. God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourself, therefore, in the mighty hand of God, and He will exalt you in due time. So how do you humble yourself? Well, it's very simple. Every morning I wake up, I ask God to search my heart and show me if there's something in my heart that's not right. If I did something that hurt somebody, or if I made Him sad by my attitude or pride. Pride is the beginning of the fall. Pride destroys what God has done. And so many people have fallen because of pride. Pride comes before a fall, the Bible says. So the first thing I do in the morning is I ask God to search my heart, just like David said. David prayed, Lord, search my heart. Show me if there's any iniquity in my heart. Who can go to the hill of the Lord, and who can stand in that holy place? But he who has clean hands and a pure heart, and has not lifted up his soul to falsehood. So every day I do that, and I ask God to search my heart, and I allow Him time to show me, and He often does. And it's no fun when the Holy Spirit reveals things that God does not like. But it's very important. If you want to walk with Jesus, you have to walk in humility. Just like I was, washing the feet of the disciples in the refugee camp. I have to humble myself, and it's not just once you do that, but you have to do it daily. Jesus said, if you want to follow me, if anyone wants to come after me, let him deny himself. Denying yourself means to humble yourself. That not my will. God, I don't want to do my thing, my will, my pleasure. But I want to do your will. Your will be done. That Jesus taught His disciples how to pray that. When they asked Him how to pray, He said, pray that my kingdom come and my will be done. And so that's the first thing we need to do every day, to take up our cross and say, Lord, not my will be done today, but your will be done. And say that I don't know what to do. But God has given us His Holy Spirit. And it's no longer I pray this out every morning too. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life that I now live, I live by faith in God, the Son of God, who loved me and gave His life for me. So He is everything to me. He is the reason why I didn't kill myself when I was 17 years old. He gave me abundant life. And so I want to use that life to bring Him glory and honor. And the only way to do it is to live for Him every day, and not to do your own will, but to do His will. And we always make mistakes. Everybody sins and falls short of God's glory. But thank God He's given us His Spirit that teaches us. The Holy Spirit is our teacher. He's our comforter. He's our helper. He helps us to humble ourselves. And sometimes I think, that He humbles us just so that we stay close to Him. Because that is so important to realize that without God, without the Holy Spirit, we can do nothing. Even David went through so much trials and tribulations and attacks on his life. but he always would humble himself and get right with God. Even when he was committed adultery and was a part of committing murder, that he went through a long time of being disciplined and tested and taught by God so that he would be humble. And Moses was a proud man and a ruler in Egypt, but God led him into the wilderness to take care of a bunch of sheep. And he became humble and meek. He became the humblest man on earth because he learned that it's only God. God cannot save the Israelites. Only God can do that. And so he became a heart of humility so that God could use him. 40 years in the wilderness. And some of us, including me, I've been many years in the wilderness learning how to be humble, how to walk, to do only that which pleases God, just like Jesus. Even he learned obedience through the things that he suffered. He learned how to humble himself and do nothing unless the Father showed him. God, he probably could have done a lot of miracles and a lot of great things because he could do anything. He can walk on the water. He probably could have walked on water back and forth and told the disciples that, hey, you guys go on the boat. I'm going to walk on the water. La, 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 la. But he didn't do that to show his power and who he was. He only did what the Father showed him to do. I'm sure he could have multiplied the fish and the loaves to hundreds of thousands instead of just thousands. But he only did it when God showed him to do that. And so we need to learn how to hear what God is speaking to us every day and to do what Jesus did, to only do the things that the Father does, shows him what to do. And we, just as the Father sent Jesus, Jesus said, so I send you. And behold, I am with you always. That's speaking about the Holy Spirit. And so we need to learn how to be sensitive to the Spirit of God in us. Another thing I do every morning, just for you guys who want to take notes, is I quote what Jesus said. He said in John 17, if you love me, you will obey my word. And my Father will love you. And we will come and make our abode, our home in you. Isn't that such an amazing mystery? You know, sometimes we wonder, where is God? You know, is he up there in heaven? And we say, God in heaven, help us, you know. But he's with us. He said he will never leave us or forsake us. So we need to come to that revelation that God is with us 24 hours a day. He will never leave us. So you don't need to ask God, where are you? He is with us now, and he will never leave us. And we need to remind ourselves that daily and choose not to do the things that are pleasing to our flesh, but to only do those things that are pleasing to God. And humility, humbling ourselves, is saying, God, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. The Spirit helps us. It says in Romans chapter 8 that we don't know how to pray, but the Spirit himself helps us in our weakness. He prays through us with groans that we don't understand. And I'll talk more about that later of how we pray for revival. But when we learn that we're not alone, that Holy Spirit helps us to hear the voice of God living in us, and so that we can do only those things that are pleasing to him and do his will, not my will. So that's why I say, God, not my will be done, but let your will be done today. And believe me, when you do that every day for many years, it starts to work. You learn by practice. And, if we believe, the Bible says, from our innermost being will come rivers of living water. And see, the more we practice, the more we do what God has told us to do, His will, we start to see His will being done in our lives and through our lives. You start to have testimonies like I've been telling you now of peoples who get saved and lives have been transformed because of God in us, not us. We can do nothing. Every good thing and every perfect gift comes down from above, from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. It's God in us. We are His temple. We don't belong to ourselves anymore, it says in Romans. But we've been bought with a price by the precious blood of Jesus Christ. He has redeemed us. He's filled us with His Spirit, just like in the book of Acts, how the first church, they were doing their own will and they were doing their own thing. They were complaining, who's the greatest? And they had a lot of problems. Like the sons of thunder, when somebody was not listening and following Jesus, they said to Jesus, should we call fire from heaven to come down and to destroy them? And Jesus says, you don't know what spirit you're in. That was not a humble spirit. That was pride. Look at us. We are following the real Messiah. But Jesus said that we need to be humble. And when they're complaining who's the greatest, Jesus took some children and said, if you want to be great in the kingdom, you have to become like these children. And if you want to be first, you need to become a slave. That's really being humble. So I'll tell some of the stories of how God humbled me in the refugee camp. The first one was, there was a time where I was actually taking care of the fish ponds that we had in the refugee camp in the agricultural school. And I always, like I said in the beginning, of my teaching here, I wanted to become a forest ranger, to take care of the trees and the bears and the animals in the forest. But then God called me, so I had to leave that dream away. But then I come to the refugee camp, and not only was I the leader of the construction, I took over the fish farm that we had. And we had ducks and chickens and doves, and we had two boa constrictor huge snakes, and lots of fish and cows and pigs, and it was like a farm. And because there was no animals in the refugee camp, all the little children would come, the schools would come, and they would come like they're looking in a zoo. So I actually kind of became a zookeeper. And but there was one refugee who had leprosy, who would come and steal our food and steal things from our fish farm. And it made me so angry that I just wanted to catch him and bring him to the jail, the camp jail, and put him in jail. It made me so angry because, we were trying to feed the animals with these things and get the fish so that we could feed the hospitals and different places, the poor and needy in the refugee camp. But this guy was coming in to steal behind my back. And so I was praying and I was really angry. And I was, saying, God, do something with this guy. And then I heard the Holy Spirit, that still quiet voice, speaking to me, not in my ears, but deep into my heart, that nobody in this world loves this young man, not even his mother. And I felt so terrible. I thought, here I am, the missionary. I'm supposed to love everybody. I'm even supposed to love my enemies. And when somebody steals your things, that you're supposed to give your coat too. You're supposed to give more instead of be angry and throw them in jail. That was my thinking back then. And so I prayed and I said, Lord, forgive me. I repent of my bad attitude and that I don't love this refugee. He had leprosy, had gone through so much suffering. And And I said, God, give me your love for him. So the next time I saw him come into our fish farm, I invited them to come to my office. It was on bamboo floating on the fish farm, the pond. And I invited him for something to eat. And I gave him some food, and I just talked to him and asked him, what about of his life? How is he doing? And he told me his story. He said that when he was just a boy in the communist takeover, that he had got this leprosy disease. And his parents were afraid that they would catch the disease, and his brothers and sisters would also get leprosy. So they told him as a little boy that he had to go and not come home. So they sent him out and rejected him just as a little boy. So the way he survived, he would just go to different homes, stealing from them just to eat. And the people were afraid that they would catch the disease, so they wouldn't touch him. And then he survived through these in this communist regime takeover. And then when he got to the refugee camp, he just kept on doing, even though he got food from the United Nations, and he got medicine for his leprosy, and he was getting healed from his leprosy. Still, he was a kleptomaniac. He was addicted to stealing. That's what it is. When you do something all the time, you're addicted to it and you can't get over it, just like an alcoholic. So wherever he would go, he would steal. And so when I heard that story, it made me feel so sad, and God gave me his heart for him. And so I invited him to come to my office, and I was teaching him the Bible. And he got baptized, he got saved, and he got baptized in the Youth of the Mission fish pond. And his life was transformed, and he was so radical, he became the evangelist of the hospitals. He wasn't afraid of anybody. So he'd go through the hospitals telling people about Jesus and preaching to people to get saved. And he was just an amazing guy. But God transformed his life. Love, the Bible says, overcomes a multitude of sins. And see, God will use us to love the unlovable, because it's not us. I had no love for this guy. I was so angry, I wanted to throw him in jail. But the Holy Spirit downloads love. Like it says, that out of your innermost being will flow rivers of life, rivers of living water. It's God, Christ in us, the hope of glory. I have a picture of this refugee and his family. He got married, had 2 kids, and what a powerful story. How God has turned this thief that was hopeless and everybody hated him into somebody who became a loving evangelist who everybody loved. God can do anything if we allow him. And then I have another story. I was telling you at the beginning about this Barnabas, the son of encouragement, who became one of the leaders of these churches in the refugee camps of 300,000. And he became the one who was writing music like David did with the Cambodian instruments. And he became world famous because his books and his songs are everywhere around the world now, and all through Cambodia. And but then I was also telling how the story about how my wife became sick and we came to Finland, and how God gave me a heart for Russia, and I started to go into Russia. But I was asked again if I would come to help to restart lähetykseen, or YWAM, Youth of the Mission, in Finland. And so this time I knew that God had called me to Finland. and called me to reach the young people of Finland. So I gave up that vision of Cambodia to obey God. And so my family, we moved to Helsinki, and then I heard about, how there was no unity in the churches. They were struggling, and somebody told me the only time that the churches worked together in Finland was when Billy Graham came. That they actually worked together, doing things together and praying together. And I thought, this is not right. God, I saw you, God, bring unity to these Cambodian pastors. You can do that in Helsinki too. And I was living on the edge of Helsinki and Vantaa, in Heikinlaakso, and there's the highest place in all of Helsinki is right there. And so every day I would go up to that prayer mountain overlooking Helsinki and Vantaa, and I was praying, God, bring unity and revival to Finland. And Lord, do your will. And then I heard that Finland was on the top of the list in the whole world for suicides. And I thought, how can that be? Finland is such a beautiful, clean country. And the people, they have social service. Nobody's poor here. Nobody's starving. Why are they killing themselves? And Jesus taught his disciples to pray that his will be done and his kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. So I started to pray every day up on my prayer mountain in Heikinlaakso. God, let your will be done. Stop these Finns from killing themselves. And as an intercessor, I always pray, or I come to know that you have no authority in your prayers if you're not willing to be a part of the answer. So I started to pray, Lord, touch these people, find them before they kill themselves. And every day for 4 years I did that. And then I was also a part of Helsinki for Christ. So on Friday nights, I would go out with Tapani Suonto and the pastors of the different churches in Helsinki, evangelizing on the streets. And one night, Friday night, a young man came to me and said, I'm going to kill myself. I thought, why is he telling me that? And so I asked him, why are you going to kill yourself? And he said his best friend just died of an overdose of drugs, and he's going home to do the same thing. And so I thought, what should I say to God? What do I do? And then the thought came to me, ask him to go out for a hamburger. So I said, can I take you for a hamburger? And I've never seen a young man turn away a hamburger in my life. Free hamburger. So I took him to the Carl's place in across from the train station and bought him a hamburger and became his friend. That's what he needed. His best friend just died, so he needed to be a friend, somebody he can talk to. And so I became his friend. And that young man, the last I heard, he was a missionary. That's what God's plan was for his life. Not that he killed himself, but that he finds Jesus as his friend. Jesus loves everyone, and he wants everyone to know him like a friend. That kind of intimate relationship that David had and Moses had and Peter and Paul and all the disciples. God wants us to be close and intimate with him. And then I was in a prayer meeting, and somebody knocked on the door. And I wonder, who's late for the prayer meeting? And we opened the door, and somebody's standing there saying, I'm going to kill myself. So we invited him into the prayer meeting, prayed for him, and he didn't kill himself. But he found out God's purpose for his life. I was speaking in Järvenpää Free Church. And the church was packed, and at the very end of the meeting, somebody came and sat in the back row. And I felt like the Lord spoke to me to go talk to this man. And so I went to the back of the church, sat next to him at the very end of the meeting. Usually when you stop speaking, you invite people to come to the front to pray for them. Well, the Holy Spirit told me to go to sit with him in the back. And I asked him, why did you come in at the end of the meeting? And he said, I don't know. I was on my way home to kill myself, and somebody made me come in here, and I don't know who or why I'm here. So we were able to tell him about Jesus, and he didn't kill himself. This is what God wants. God wants us to reach these people that are killing themselves, and we need to be a part of the answer. And I saw almost every church, every meeting I went to speak in Helsinki and anywhere in Finland, almost everybody was at that point that they, many people were telling me that they wanted to kill themselves. And I found in the Finnish churches, that there's so little people going out to reach these people. God did not make us to be church lights, but He is the light of the world, and we're not to hide our light, but we are to be street lights, so that the people who are out there will see the love and the life of Christ, His light in us, and they will come to the light and be saved from the darkness. In Jesus' name. Hello, friends. I want to talk to you about revival. I want you to know that revival is coming to Finland. And actually, it's already started. And that's what I'll be teaching about, is the little signs of revival that I've seen in the north, south, east, and west of Finland as I've been praying for every city and town in Finland and seeing what God is doing. God wants you to know. And this generation is a visual generation. And the young people, they want to see God moving. They don't want to just hear about it, what's happening in Africa or someplace else. They want to actually see it with their own eyes. And TV7 is going to bring this news to you that you can share, and that these young people can start to see that God is moving in a powerful way, even in Finland. And if you would like to support this ministry and get this visual generation, the messages that they can actually see what God is doing, and get them understanding that God is moving right now, not just someplace in the future, then they will get excited and they will want to come and listen and come to know this Jesus that is moving around them. That young people are coming to Christ more than ever before in this nation. And we need to believe that this is the generation that is seeking after God. So they will show you how you can support this ministry of TV7. God bless you.